Welcome to Global Polarity. I'm your host, Dr. Digby James Wren, and today we're going to have a look at, Global Polarity is one of my publications, and in this Substack we're looking most closely at the transition to multipolarity, the BRICS and the Global South, the emerging economies of the Global South. This is our main focus. So today I really want to look at very closely the situation regarding the wars that are currently in place. So Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Lebanon, the US, Israel, Iran, and rising tensions in other parts of the world that relate to this. And that, of course, is, as if any of my listeners would know, that the understanding that the Americans, specifically the Americans and to a lesser degree the Europeans, are resisting the transition of wealth and power to the Global South, specifically the BRICS countries: Russia, China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, Turkey, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and others. Now, in relation to the wars that are ongoing, let's first start with the ceasefire between the US, Israel, and Iran. It is increasingly clear, more and more reports, specifically 2 reports from Russian intelligence. There's availability here. If you just go to any of the Russian sites, specifically TASS, you're going to see these comments, but they can be found in Al Jazeera and other news sites, that it looks increasingly likely that this is really just a hiatus, allowing the Americans to plan another attack. And there is now something like 50,000 American servicemen of all descriptions, but the actual soldiers on the ground, special forces operations, deltas, rangers, those sorts of people, Marines, that's a much smaller number, somewhere in the vicinity of 5 to 10,000. But all of the support networks around them, it all adds up to about 50,000. Now, but there is a problem here, of course. The resupply of American naval vessels is now much more complicated because of the bases being in the Gulf now not available, and specifically the ones that are in the Gulf themselves. So that's Qatar and Bahrain the largest. They have no access to those, so how to resupply their ships, this is no longer a simple matter. That means having to, sail to Crete or sail to Greece or somewhere else, or Diego Garcia, which is so far away. So there's great complications to naval support. Must be done at a distance. Still, of course, fairly simply targeted by the Iranians and their missiles. I'm not saying that they can sink these ships. It's possible, but it's enough to keep them at arm's length. So how does this relate? Now, what's been going on with Pakistan? And I'll just correct yesterday in the podcast that I did for Long Mekong. If you want to go to the Long Mekong Substack, you can listen to that. I mentioned that the parties in Pakistan had been the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. That's incorrect. It was actually Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. But those are 3 BRICS countries that are regional powers. But Iran is also a BRICS country and a regional power, as we can all see now. UAE, Dubai, not a power, so to speak, but definitely very wealthy. And then China and Russia are also both BRICS partners. Now, Pakistan's closest ally is China, although it does still maintain a kind of a balance with the US in many ways, and that's why it's able to fulfill this function. And it's done it before. It did it for the opening to China in the 70s, and it's done it. It's been a mediator in other regional conflicts at some point or other. That's sort of a traditional role, a historic role for Pakistan, very interesting. And the Indians have been very quiet about this, allowing that to happen because it's beneficial for them to have peace in the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, Red Sea. That's beneficial to India. So they're just keeping close tabs on all of this, but they're keeping very quiet. Yes, they've got some ships going into the Arabian Sea to escort their vessels, but at this point that is really a support action and not a military one in a real sense. So what I'm trying to say here is that those BRICS countries are now basically the core of the new regional security architecture. And that means that the Americans are basically going to be seen as no longer viable as the security guarantor. This has been a long time coming, but I think this is the situation with Iran and the American aggression and Israeli aggression against Iran has shown them that the American bases and American activities in the region have become a liability to security. I mean, it is not only is it destructive, but the total instability is causing grief, and I mean real grief, just about everywhere, including Southeast Asia, other parts of Asia, Australia, New Zealand. This is a great problem for those countries, and of course for Europe. Now, why Europe has a suicidal wish to cut itself off from all useful energy sources is just beyond me. It just seems so strange that European elites have decided in some way that to fulfill their discussions with NATO or their commitments to NATO, they need to increase military spending. They want to keep supporting Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. That they're willing to spend all of their money on weapons, but cut themselves off from cheap energy. And everything that they have done over the last 3 years or 4 years points to that. It's not rational. There's the logic in here is very poor, and I don't. Just as a slight digression, I don't believe that the Hungarian change of government is going to change this situation greatly. Sure, they might be a little bit more friendly towards the EU, but then again, they also have to realize that the EU looks increasingly like a military bloc. Now, that has all sorts of other problems. The first is the nuclear powers. So the 5 nuclear powers that have the UN Security Council seats. Now, if Europe goes for its strategic autonomy, which is something that it's been talking about for a very long time, which has been, of course, opposed by the Americans and actively opposed by the Americans, interference in European political activities. I mean, blatant. I mean, completely blatant interference. They have, supported Brexit, for example, and I think that was the key point that just tripped everything and weakened all of the political situation in Europe, including in Italy, in Germany, in France, in the UK. Now, this suicidal movement that they have is basically pushed everybody either to the left or to the right. And then interestingly, of course, you see that the Americans have been openly supporting the right. They tried to support Orban, although he lost. So then you say, okay, the centrists who are again taking power in Hungary. But the centrists in the other powers, so Germany, France, the UK, they are being squeezed. And American support for the right, because they are just ideologically and fundamentally opposed to anything that's of the left. If any American says, "Oh, the Democrats are the left," well, they're not. I mean, they're not in real terms. They basically conduct the same foreign policy as the Republicans in a real sense. I mean, either more or less, but it's definitely making interference, that foreign policy interference, intervention, subversions, color revolutions, funding for social media campaigns to undermine governments and so forth. And this is very clear in Southeast Asia, also in South America, in Central Asia. This has put Europe in a very, very weak position. And if this continues, if we continue to see problems here with energy supply, the supply of helium, the supply of fertilizers, the supply of oils, the supply of gas, Europe's position is only going to become worse. And then the next election cycle is next year, 27 and 28. What is going to happen? So I'm now no longer believe that the Ukraine crisis will continue much more than, I think, a year is the maximum. I think it's all pointing to, the signs are all pointing to a collapse of the Ukraine forces. They are overstretched. They have very limited manpower. The quality of that manpower is questionable. Their weapons productions in Ukraine are very limited now, and that means that they're coming from Europe and other places. I think that those supply chains are going to be targeted. I don't necessarily mean militarily, but definitely squeezed. A lot of the components and pieces that are built into the weapons that they're producing come from Asia, specifically China and other Southeast Asian countries. I think that's going to be squeezed at some point. Indonesia, for example, one of the BRICS countries, the President Prabowo is now talking with Putin. Now, while there's talk about allowing Americans overflight in Indonesia, what does that really mean, overflight? So from the bases, American bases, what, in the Philippines, Singapore, Australia? Is that what that means? So American aircraft that are based in those other countries are going to be able to fly over Indonesia? Sure, they might do that. There's a short-term gain in that. There must have been a quid pro quo. I imagine that's going to be very much like what the Indians have done previously, and that is to get missile guidance systems, access to military technology or weapon systems, other technologies, perhaps AI, NVIDIA chips, all that sort of thing. There's a bargain in there. It's not a long-term bargain. It's a short-term bargain. Indonesia is going to stay as unaligned as it wishes to be. It's not going to go into any military alliance with the US. Equally, it's not going to go into a military alliance with China or India or anybody else. What Indonesia's basic foreign policy objective always is, and has been for a long time, is to ensure that the Southeast Asian ASEAN bloc and the greater ASEAN bloc, which you might call RCEP, remains strong, robust. That is their prime concern. They are going to keep doing that. And to that end, I have to say that makes we need to have a quick look at Myanmar in that. And that's a very tricky situation in Myanmar. Now, I'm going to devote a podcast entirely to Myanmar in the future, which I'll probably do in ASEAN Chair Substack or in Long Mekong Substack, very focused to that particular outcome. But definitely we can see that there is a real effort on behalf of the Americans, specifically the Americans, but others also, to continue to try to weaken Myanmar. And whatever the narrative is, the reality is that the vast majority of the population, 60% of the population, is Burmese. They control most of the agricultural land, and the key point about Myanmar is access to the sea. And so the fighting on the coast is all about trying to cut the Burmese central Myanmar, cut it off from the sea, access to the sea, which would also damage the pipelines and the transport lines, highways that go back into China. So there's a sort of another advantage there. But I see at this time the balance between China and India relating to Myanmar is to maintain stability on their borders around Myanmar, and the others are making all the noises that they want to make to try to keep public opinion thinking that this is about getting rid of a military dictatorship, where in real terms it's about control of supply chains once again and cutting off the main largest population group in Myanmar who have always held power there. from the sea. And then as a secondary or even as their primary benefit, cutting China's access to the Bay of Bengal. I don't think in the long term this can work. Eventually this problem, the Myanmar problem, is an ASEAN problem, as I said. Indonesia doesn't want it to happen. But we can see that the Buddhist kingdoms, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, not to mention Nepal, are also in play. And I think that is also related to the election cycles into 27, 28. That's going to be very difficult. I think slowly but surely the Americans are working towards the idea of getting more friendly governments in both of those countries. It's going to be very difficult in Thailand, which is effectively another military dictatorship, just like Myanmar. Cambodia is not that, but it does have, of course, one family that has dominated politics in this country for 40 years. I think the next election cycle might be problematic, but that's another 2 years away. But I can see problems starting to rise here in Cambodia. Clearly Thailand is already in problems, and now those two countries, those two kingdoms, those two Buddhist nations are fighting over pieces of land, very, very small pieces of land, most famously these Buddhist, originally Hindu temples that were placed on their borders. And there is some talk about the possibility of exploitation of rare earths in those areas. But look, just to say that those mountainous areas in Southeast Asia, right along the mountainous areas through the continental Southeast Asia, if you like, is full of minerals. It's mountainous, it's forested, it has... I think the number is 63 million minority populations, and so they're very susceptible to external agitation and interference, and that's obviously been going on for a very long time, specifically in the Golden Triangle, although you might have noticed that seems to have calmed enormously. So most recently it's always been about scams and scam centers and so forth. But one can see that the Chinese have cracked down very hard on anybody that's been involved in that on their side. And I mean, when I say crack down, I mean mass arrests, imprisonment and executions to stop this. On the other hand, the most recent arrests, there's much smaller numbers of Chinese, and you'll find that it's increasingly Vietnam, Indonesia, Thai, Indians, and others, even Europeans. So that's problematic, and most recently I think there was even Ukrainians. So that's another ongoing turbulent area. But let's get back to the BRICS problem in relation to the Middle East or West Asia, because the Middle East, of course, that terminology is colonial terminology. West Asia is probably a more neutral and correct formulation. It's only the Middle East if you're in London or Paris. For everybody else, it's West Asia. And what we see there is that those countries that are in the BRICS and that have been actively involved with Pakistan and the ceasefire and peace talks, most active are the BRICS countries. And this is, as I say, is what's leading to a new security architecture. They have the most to gain, but also in geographic terms, they also surround entirely the area. If you just look at a map, you can see this is true. And although the Americans seek to have Israel as a dominant power in that area, ultimately Israel is a very small country with a not so big economy, and it needs access, land access and sea access, but that access is all surrounded by BRICS countries. And eventually I think that Israel is not going to be able to keep conducting wars against 6 of its neighbors, and also obviously Iran. I think this is maybe in the shorter term, and perhaps in the medium term looks all right, but in the longer term, I think over a period of the next 3 to 5 years, that situation is going to be have to be cleared, clarified, negotiated in some way, and starting with, of course, with Gaza, Iran, Lebanon, Syria. Now, that's going to be the model for Southeast Asia as well. Because and I've said this many times and I've written about this many times, what the Americans here are really trying to achieve is to exert control over energy in West Asia. And by doing so, destabilize that whole area and allow Israel to be the dominant power. Number one. Two, they can then destabilize the areas, the frontiers of Iran into Central Asia, to the underbelly of Russia and Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. It also will destabilize Turkey. None of this is good. And possibly into Afghanistan, and then that affects, of course, China as well. So China and Russia have real reasons to not allow Iran to fail. It's not about whether it's a theocracy or not. And I've spoken about, the fact that Iran is a theocracy, yes, but it has so many democratic processes. The theocratic part is really on top of that. All the democratic base exists and works, functions. So that China and Russia are not going to allow that to happen. And the other BRICS nations also see that this is not good for them. How is this going to benefit them by having the Americans dominate and create more instability, more chaos in the region? And it doesn't help Europe either. And I think the Europeans really, it's very hard to understand how they can see a return to a prior situation. So let's just quickly go back and have a look at that situation. So France wants to provide a nuclear umbrella. The UK has nuclear power. They're developing new nuclear weapons. They're developing new nuclear engine propulsion systems. But if they unify and have some kind of strategic autonomy, or they rejoin EU or whatever, then it definitely means that the Security Council seats are going to have to change. And clearly India is the one that's waiting in the wings, followed closely by Brazil, for example. So that's going to be very problematic. And if now, as that is happening, we need to look at the impact on the Americans. Now, America is an island. You can say it's a continent, North America, but it's really an island. It's got oceans on both sides. Canada has a very small population, and we already know that the Americans have, Donald Trump specifically, has said that they want to have greater influence over Canada. They already have Alaska, now they want Greenland. I've talked about this in past podcasts. And the same is true now for Colombia and Venezuela and Cuba. And I think all three of those are going to come into question now, because Trump's victory arch, and I've said this before, why does he need a victory arch? Because he needs a victory. And then he wants Donald the Great. So to get that, he's going to have to win somewhere. Now, winning in Iran, I think, is already not possible. A land war there is going to be almost impossible to win. The only thing that can happen is surgical strikes. Now, those troops, the 50,000 American servicemen that are in the area, and all of the assets that they have, long-range bombers, B-1s, B-2s, aircraft carriers, endless amounts of F-16s and F-15s and all that sort of thing. But they don't have an endless amount of munitions. They need these breaks, these pauses, to be able to rebuild their munitions and resupply. But what they're going to do, of course, is they only have the ability, the capacity to make surgical strikes, and they are going to be on nuclear. So nuclear power stations, and trying to get their hands on the 400 kilos of enriched uranium. Now, there's lots of alternatives for this uranium. It can be blended down to make it 40%, 50% enriched, still enough for civil power. But the Americans are going to try and get all of that. They can claim that as a victory. They're going to try and destroy the nuclear power, or at least disable it for as long as they can. And of course, they're going to try and kill more leaders of Iran's leadership. They're going to try and destroy that completely. I think this is increasingly what's going to happen, and we need to worry very much about that in the next week or so, what's going to happen there. In the meantime, the Americans are desperate to keep China out of this, also Russia. They're not able to impose sanctions on China anymore. There's a new law just been passed in China that's going to allow the Chinese to, because the Americans always claim that they're acting within international law, but they're not. They're acting under this sort of what they call the rules-based order, but those rules it's not law. It's just what they want. And of course, famously, the Americans are not party to UNCLOS. They have never ratified that. So they can operate. Freedom of operation is really just a power play. There's no legality in any of that. So. And every other treaty, and they've pulled out of all the multilaterals and all the UN, basically trying to weaken the UN because, of course, there's opposition from the majority of the UN, and even, of course, in Europe. So they are just going to have to go it alone, and this means that they are now subject to their financial markets coming under increasing strain. Inflation, dissatisfaction in purchasing power, living standards of the population, and I mean a majority of the population. And then there's also the bond markets, the equity markets, the AI bubble, which is definitely a bubble, the inability to provide electricity for that, and I've talked about this in the past too, that to build sufficient energy supply to have all these AI centers that they're going to build in these fabs for semiconductors, they need to roll out enormous infrastructure building for electrical power. I think that's going to be very difficult for them. And then there's their national debt, which is standing at 39 trillion. How are they going to service that? It's now bigger than their military budget. Well, Trump says he's going to spend more money. One of the realities of economics is that as long as you're printing the money in your own country and spending it in your own country, then the military can be supplied. As long as you can do that at home, domestically. But the Americans are not in that position, are they? They don't have access to critical minerals. That lever can be pulled. They don't have access to, for example, transformers for electricity, which would also come from China. And they don't have access to lots of other goods, and intermediary goods, the components that you need to construct other things. There's all sorts of problems in metals, aluminum, tungsten, and then of course all the rare earths and the critical minerals. There's a huge list of that. But even as they scramble with their allies like Australia and Canada and so forth, let's just say Canada's not really an ally at the moment, although it's still in NATO, of course. But hedging, and so is Australia. Well, yes, getting access to the minerals is one thing, and then holding on to that is another thing. Building the mines, increasing their production. They're still going to face the problem with processing. No matter what they do, they're still going to have to face that problem. So really the second wave is not really getting the stuff out of the ground, which is going to take a few years. It's being able to process it, and that's going to take even longer. And there's always the environmental concerns to do with that, the technology to do with that. And I think China is going to be getting equivalent chips to what NVIDIA can provide within the next year or two. And the Americans are not going to be able to, in the same time, get their electricity supply sufficiently organized, their supply chains sufficiently organized. So they're going to... we're at a tipping point. This is literally a tipping point. I think the limits of American power are now... They have reached the apogee. It's all downhill. I cannot see a rising America in the future. I just don't see that anymore at all. I always thought that, or I had thought for a very longest time that was possible, that the Americans could do that. But to do it, they need to collaborate, cooperate with everybody. But they're continuing exceptionalism and desire to return to the post-World War II framework and the post-collapse of Soviet Union position is it's never coming back. That ship has sailed. That's just never going to happen. So the fallback position is Greenland, Canada, Cuba, Colombia, Venezuela, and trying to effectively control all of South America. I think it's not possible either. Maybe, once again, they can have short-term gains, but if they do not cooperate and understanding that China is the champion of free trade in the world today, that was the American position, and they've given it up. And one has to remember that China looks at the world as not as a singularity, not as we are the dominant power, we are going to impose our power, we are going to impose our economic power, our military power, our diplomatic power, our financial power, to subjugate or to suborn other powers. China sees itself as a stable, central power for the whole globe. And it doesn't have a history of trying to expand its influence through military expansion. It just doesn't exist. It's reached most of its natural borders, so it's going to stay there. So that leads us to the situation where, for China, it's always about maintaining a balance for everybody to still be able to operate globally, but with a balance of power. So multipolarity is part of that. And so where China is one of the poles, India is poles, and then the US becomes one of the poles. And it's been talked about by Rubio and others and Vance, but they reject the idea. Specifically, it's rejected by all those that would lose something. And that, of course, is the very large military-industrial complex, the energy industry. They all see that as a losing argument because they will feel and they know that they cannot compete at the same level. They're just going to be more expensive and much slower, and they don't have the advanced manufacturing that China has and the capacity to build. China can outproduce America 3-1, 4-1, if not more. So that's just a losing argument. So the only way for them to do it is to have this sort of, Dunrow doctrine. That's the fallback position. And I think that's really what's going to happen. They're going to be restricted to that. And so what we're going to see is those bases in the Gulf are going to close sooner or later, at some point or other. They're going to be vacated. Now, I don't believe that Russia and China are going to build new bases there, but what we can see is Turkey, for example, has been very active with Somalia, with Syria, with all of its neighbors, and as I say, it's in NATO, but it's also part of the BRICS, and fundamentally it's got to be about their economy. It's always about the economy, stupid, and so that is true for Egypt, that is true for Ethiopia, that is true for Saudi Arabia, that is true for the UAE, that is true for Iran, that is true for China, and it is true for Russia. Which brings me back to my initial point, which is that this grouping is going to provide the new security architecture. And there's a model for that, and that is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It already exists. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to be included in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I don't believe that is necessarily going to be the way it's done. It could be done through the SCO, but then I think it's going to be its own regional architecture. Now, this is something that the Russians have also talked about with Ukraine. Now, right now, the Russian spring offensive has basically started. And all along the line of contact, from the north to the south, Russians are advancing. Now, I go to Weeb Union on YouTube. He's very good. He's Danish. He's been doing this since the conflict started. Have a look at his maps. They're updated every day. He gives very good reports. Have a look at those, and you will see what's really going on the ground. It's highly likely, as I said before, that this is going to end within the next 12 months. The Russians need to get to the Dnieper. I think I read a report today that Dnipro has become sort of center of logistics for the Ukrainians. It was always a center, but it's becoming more important as the Russians advance slowly towards the Dnieper. And from day one, day one from the special military operation, I have stated both privately and publicly that the Dnieper is the key objective. To control Ukraine, one needs to control the Dnieper. The west, Galicia, the west of Ukraine, is at best a plethora, a myriad of claims on Ukraine, or what we see now as Ukraine. There are so many countries there that want and have historically wanted or have held parts of that, and at some point or other, once the Russians achieve their objectives, which is what they're going to do, they're not going to have a ceasefire or a cessation until they do that. And to do that, they need to control the Dnieper and possibly Odessa. And so, until that happens, I think that will continue, but it looks more and more that the Ukraine is, Zelensky's government is going to fall in the very near future. I can't give you an actual date on that, but I can't see it lasting that much longer. It's just not possible. Once the Russians make their break, they've almost got through all of the major defensive lines that the Ukrainians had built over the last 10 years, 12 years since 2014. They are almost through all of those. And once they go through that, what's going to stop them getting to the Dnieper? And once they control the Dnieper, they don't need to go any further. So that's going to be peace in the Ukraine. But I don't think it's peace with Ukraine. I don't believe that's true. So what's going to happen, of course, is all the surrounding powers, Hungary, Moldova, Poland, Lithuania, etc., they are all going to make claims. Romania are going to make claims on what is now considered to be Ukraine territory. And that includes into the Black Sea, oil and gas, specifically Romania. That is what's going to happen. Yes, the UK and the French say they're going to put some stabilizing force into there because they see that this is what is going to need to be done. Somebody somehow is going to have to stabilize the western part of Ukraine. How that's going to be achieved? Well, one can say that the Americans have actually achieved their prime objective, which was to partition Europe more. So it means that basically NATO is moved almost up to the Dnieper. So NATO has expanded, regardless of the special military operation. NATO has still expanded, including Sweden and Finland. But the EU and NATO are now contradictory, I think. That the idea that originally what it was, the Americans always said, yes, you can join the EU, we will support countries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe joining the EU as long as they also join NATO. But now I think NATO, and especially in the time of Trump, that situation has fundamentally changed. And the EU really is not going to be able to benefit from American largesse and American desires. What the Americans are going to do is start increasing their support for right-wing parties in Europe. It's going to be worse for Europe. As I said, I repeat that again. How the Europeans believe that any of this has been good for them is just beyond comprehension. Now let's just quickly go to East Asia and have a look at the situation of South Korea and Japan. There is enormous energy reserves, mineral reserves right at their doorstep. They do not need to be importing all of this from the US or from Middle East, West Asia, or anywhere else. I mean, they can. Why not, if they can? But I think this problem here with the Hormuz has demonstrated that they're much better off looking in their own neighbourhood. And now, so sure, CPTPP, so Japanese initiative basically. In fact, it's always been the Japanese that have been driving Indo-Pacific, not the Americans. It's the Japanese who want this, much more than the others. And for obvious reasons. They need to keep their supply chains open. And they see that they are fearful that China could affect some kind of interruption on their supply chains. I mean, just look at a map. They import all their energy, both those countries. Look, it's a long-term losing game. The American power, the diminishment of American power, is going to also diminish the need for Japan and Korea to rely on them, which opens a whole new box of goodies, which one day we'll discuss the possible economic boom in Northeast Asia, because the situation of North Korea, which is mineral rich, by the way, and anybody who thinks that North Koreans are not the same as South Koreans it just really doesn't know their history. They are capable of doing everything technologically if they want to, and they can, and they've proven it. They're building submarines, they have nuclear missiles, they have all the things that a modern economy can have. And sure, it's not perfect in any way, but they do have that. But what I'm trying to say here is that it's North Korea that sort of blocks the growth of Northeast Asian economies. The integration of the Northeast Asian economies also needs to be looked at very, very carefully. And so RCEP kind of works slightly, so binding it to Southeast Asia. CPTPP also binding it across the Pacific. That works okay. But only if China's in it. If China's not in it, then it won't function. And so what Japan and Korea need to look at is that if they want to have renewed economic growth, they have to take steps to strengthen the regional economy. And that includes Russia and North Korea. Now, the minute they start to do that, they are going to get a huge economic boom. Solving the North Korea problem is related to this. This is the fundamental question. And long ago, Kissinger wrote that the only way that this can be solved, can be unlocked, is by US forces leaving Korea. Because remember, they are the forces that invaded Korea. The argument that North Korea invaded South Korea is just silly, because South Korea was just a fabricated country at that time. It's evolved, of course, the situation has evolved, but let's remember that it was a civil war. And that it was the forces that had opposed the Japanese that were in the north, and they were conducting. What they were trying to do, of course, was eliminate the final foreign forces that were there, which was the Americans. That failed, obviously, and so we have this situation now that needs to be unlocked, and it's going to be good for everybody in that region. Now, Japan could see itself clear to trying to do that, instead of acting the way it is by putting missiles and by really breaking its own constitution, which of course was written by MacArthur. And the history of MacArthur and his father in the Philippines is another question. But this clearly is not going to be helping them in the long run, and their economy is going to become weaker and weaker. And the two economies that worry me the most in real terms are Japan and the UK. The collapse of either of those economies, or they could, either of those, trigger a real collapse of the US economy. That is entirely possible. And, French have just repatriated all their gold. They did it in a very clever way, and they got their gold back. But everybody's going to start doing this. It makes sense to do it. And treasuries, if they want to go liquid and support their currencies, they're going to have to sell US treasuries. I think the US is really sitting on a tightrope here. Now, I've mentioned before in a few articles that I think that Donald Trump entered into imperium. I mean, the US is no longer talking about being a hegemon or hegemon. It's about imperium. And Donald Trump sees himself as the as the new empire, the ruler of a new American empire, the Golden Age empire. And you can see that in just the decorations in the White House and this new triumphal arch he wants, and having, July 14 or July 4th parades down in Washington, all that sort of thing. I mean, he's all of the accoutrement, all of the extra things that you surround yourself with of empire is what he's doing. Anybody who's looked at, just look at what Napoleon was doing, just look at what Caesar was doing, just look at any empire like that. This is what Donald Trump is doing. One should also have a very close look at J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio and how they believe, what they believe in terms of rebuilding American political structure. It's worrying, and yes, I think the apogee of American power has been reached. All of this points to that, and we're going to see this transfer of security to the BRICS countries. It's happening whether the Americans like it or not. I think they just cannot win in West Asia. I don't see it happening. And they're going to get their victories under the Dunro Doctrine. That's all possible. But they are not going to be able to do it in Southeast Asia, even though that's what they're looking to do. And of course, at every moment in this thinking, in their actions, is the idea that they have to bring down the economy of China. Now, they're finding that almost impossible to do. China just posted record numbers for export growth again in the first quarter of 2026. It's got GDP growth of 5%. Now, as long as the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians keep balancing, understanding that there's always going to be an opposition, but creating the situation where it's really only poles, I think the Americans just don't have any possibility here. And they are not in a position to be able to wage a war in Asia, and this has always been the case. Sure, they should be trying to strengthen Europe if they really want to do that. And they should be trying to bring the Russians in, which I think we can see that they actually have been trying to do that at some point. If you look closely at Trump's actions with Russia, you can see that there has been some overtures there to try and do that. They understand that they need to get although they exacerbated the situation, but ultimately they're going to need Russia. And I think that's really true everywhere. Russia is going to play a more important role in the world. And Indonesia, for example, as I said, the president is now speaking with Putin, and it's going to be about securing oil, about securing energy and minerals and technology, weapons, and other things. And from China too. I think this is the way it's going. I don't think the Americans have any technological advantages that really make any difference anymore. Sure, Nvidia is the most valuable company in the world, but it's priced in dollars, it's domestically priced, everybody wants the best chips, sure, but who really uses these chips? Think about it. This is just a very, very, very small portion of all the chips in the world. And ultimately, the biggest markets are not in the US, and not even in Europe anymore. And the Europeans need to be able to build that as well. And everybody's going to. Now, let's just talk about this AI boom just for one moment. I'm going to wrap up on this one, but what are the Americans trying to achieve here? And the answer is, what they're trying to achieve is it's technological determinism, in the sense that we have the tech, so we determine what happens to you and your economy. But this is no longer true except in AI. And even that is only really in the sense that it's the very large tech companies in America that have some global monopoly in real terms. We all know who they are: Google, Apple, Oracle, etc. Facebook, the 7 of them, Tesla. Those companies, what they're doing is they're trying to ensure that global domination of the digital infrastructure of the globe and everything that goes on that and over that and through that, so which is basically services, digital monies, digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, not Bitcoin. They are all powered by this, and the problem with this is that the position of the American economy relative to the world just doesn't justify the idea that they should be able to dominate in this area. Now, I think we're looking at that ending within the next 5 years. No matter what happens with the AI building, sure, the US are going to still be really strong, and their social media companies and media companies are still going to be strong, sure, but they are no longer going to be monopolies. And what we can see here is this is one of the major objectives of the American administrations. I almost said regimes, because Trump's looking more and more like a regime in the American sense. Imperium. They are going to lose that power. And we can see that the Europeans are legislating against it. The Chinese have already done that. The Indians are starting to do it. Just look how many engineers India's got. Look how many engineers China has. Look how many engineers Russia has. That is going to come to an end too. And because they don't have energy, that's going to give them even greater problems. So, which is one reason why West Asia has got so many AI and data centers, because it's got lots and lots of energy to be able to power them. And those chips, remember these chips, they only have a lifespan. You just look at the cycle that NVIDIA is releasing new chips. Just have a look at that cycle. It seems like it's annual, but they're only just incremental. The real cycle, the real boost is basically every 3 to 4 years. And that may accelerate, but it'll accelerate not necessarily in America. It'll accelerate everywhere. The competition between China and the US in that area, for example, is going to accelerate the advancements. Huawei is making huge steps towards this, lithography and so forth. The idea that ASML has a monopoly, for example, is another blatant situation that is going to be addressed by the entire global South. Nobody wants this. The Americans are going to lose their monopoly powers eventually. And this is what is powering the AI bubble. And this is going to continue until it bursts. And it's going to burst when it's clear to everybody that really that's not the only solution. There are other solutions, and they're not just American. They're going to be European, Russian, Chinese, Indian, Brazilian. Brazil has a vibrant sector. So, to sum up, the situation that we have now is, with these ceasefires, I think, is a pause for new attacks, because they're all in. Now, they're going to try and get the enriched uranium. They're going to try and seize the nuclear plant and destroy it, Bashir. They are going to try and take Karg Island, and if they can't hold it, they'll destroy it, so Iran fundamentally will not be able to supply as much oil. They are going to try and restrict all shipping into Iran. I think this is just too big. They're not going to be able to achieve this. They couldn't do it in Vietnam. They couldn't do it in Korea. They have... Iraq is still precarious. Syria, I think, is still precarious. And I'm beginning to believe now that Israel's situation is becoming precarious. And the sooner that the Israelis get rid of the Netanyahu government, the better off they'll be. They need to come up with something comprehensive. So this BRICS, I won't call it BRICS actually, but I'll just say BRICS members, new security architecture is going to include so many of them around the Red Sea, East Africa, the Mediterranean, Suez Canal, Strait of Hormuz, access to the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, is going to put Israel into a very tight situation, and they need to see that. And the reason that they're so adamant trying to create chaos in Iran is because they see that coming, and they need to stop it, and the Americans also want to stop that. But I think it's a losing game. Let's see if I'm right. I think I'm going to get a lot of interviews if I am. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to this, my longest ever podcast for Global Polarity. And hope to see you very, very soon in the next edition, which should be next week for Global Polarity. But every day, one of my Substacks has a podcast. So stay tuned. The links are usually posted with this. So if you can, and to keep this alive, it's always good if people subscribe. It's not expensive. So yep, give it a thumbs up, a like button if you appreciate the content. Please comment and give guidance on whatever you think is important that I've not talked about, or if I've made any errors or whatever. I'm very interested to hear from my listeners. That number has increased enormously over the last 12 months. I know that I have not been, shall we say, doing this daily, but there has been breaks, some of them related to my health issues, but and other issues. But I'm trying to get this to a daily basis if I can, and so of course any support is going to be greatly appreciated. So thank you. It's goodbye from me, from Dr. Digby James Wren and Global Polarity.